Hello, everyone. This is Tony Costa from Toronto Apologetics. We have been doing a series on Easter, answering certain questions about Easter and responding to a number of objections that we generally hear around this time of the year about whether or not we should use the word Easter and the idea that Easter came from a spring goddess and so forth and so on. In my two previous videos, I talked about how the word Easter entered into some of our English translations and through whom and by whom they entered. And also we dealt in our previous video with, is Easter the name of Oster, a spring goddess? So today we want to deal with another question, and that of course is the question of what does the resurrection of Jesus have to do with Easter eggs and bunnies? And so around this time, you'll notice a lot of commercialism going on, people buying stuffy rabbits and bunnies and chocolate eggs and so forth and so on. So what exactly does eggs and bunnies have to do with the celebration of Easter? Well, we need to understand that the tradition of using eggs during Easter, or eating eggs or giving eggs and so forth and so on, comes from the old practice in the church of observing Lent. Now, what is Lent? Lent is a 40-day period that some Christians celebrate, beginning with Ash Wednesday. And those 40 days are supposed to commemorate the 40-day fast of Jesus in the wilderness when he was tempted by the devil. And the word Lent comes from a word that means to lengthen, the idea of stretching out. And so during Lent, many Christians, historically speaking, would give up certain food items like meat. They'd give up certain things like fish and eggs and milk and so forth during the time of Lent. And so it was supposed to be a time of refusing the pleasantries in life and so forth. And even up until the 13th century, until the 1200s, eating eggs for Lent was forbidden. So eggs were forbidden, milk was forbidden, because these were all byproducts of animals, whose flesh, of course, cattle and chickens and hens and so forth. These are byproducts of these animals. And so since you're not supposed to eat the meat of those animals, many in the church leaders reasoned that you should not eat the byproducts, that is milk and eggs and so forth. And so what that would do is that would create, if you think about it, for 40 days until you come to Easter Sunday, where you break the fast, during that 40-day period, those hens are laying a lot of eggs. And the thing about eggs is, unlike meat and milk, eggs can last. And they can last for a substantial amount of time. And so because there was this surplus of eggs during the Lenten season, by the time you get to Easter, you got all these eggs. And so what Christians came to do was they broke their fast by not only eating eggs, because it was one of the rare commodities that could actually be kept without refrigeration, and they would share it with others. And what happened was many of them began to dye these eggs with red color, with a red dye. And because the egg was associated with breaking the fast on Easter Sunday, because there were so many of them, so many eggs were laid by all these hens during that time period, a lot of Christians came to associate the egg being tainted with red dye. They came to associate that with the blood of Christ, which speaks of his passion and, of course, his death on Good Friday and so forth. And then on Easter Sunday, when they would eat the Easter eggs, what they would do is, well, you've got this red covering on top of the eggs. And then what you would do is you would peel the shell with the dye on it. And what do you have? You have this bright white egg. And so the white egg would remind these Christians of the righteousness of Christ, the righteousness of the risen Christ. And so the red representing his blood. And on Easter Sunday, when you crack those eggs, and these are hard-boiled eggs, by the way, incidentally. A lot of these eggs are hard-boiled. which again, this is how you would eat them. You would crack the shell and then you would eat them. So this is where the use of the egg comes into Easter. And later on, of course, others, instead of just painting them red, some of them also came to paint the eggs with several different colors. And so you can see how it went from one thing to another. All of a sudden, it became about decorating these eggs. And this was very common, particularly among the Eastern Church. So those in the Byzantine kingdom, those in the eastern part of Europe, the Slavs, the Russians, Ukrainians, Estonians, Lithuanians, Latvians, and so forth. These people group who were in the eastern side of Europe, this became such a well-known practice that some of them created some very ornate eggs, with designs and so forth and so on. And that, of course, was connected to the idea of Christ's resurrection, the idea of new life and so forth. Now, we also need to understand that this tradition is not just something that we see in Christianity. Now, remember, this is not something that goes back to the Bible. The Bible doesn't talk about using eggs or eating eggs to celebrate the resurrection. This is something that developed within church history, and you can see why it developed the way it did. Notice there's no connection to paganism here. They didn't get this idea from pagans. They got the use of eggs primarily because of the practice of Lent. And because of the surplus of eggs, they would use them to gift to others on Easter Sunday. Now, this tradition was not just known in the church, but we also find that in the Passover, which is the same time period in which Christians celebrate the resurrection of Christ, because Jesus died during the Passover, Jesus became our Passover lamb. It's important to understand that in the Passover Seder, when our Jewish friends celebrate Passover and they sit down and have the Passover meal, the Passover Seder dish, if you notice, contains a number of elements that are supposed to remind them of the Exodus, their liberation. And you will notice that among the items on the Passover Seder dish, you have the egg. The egg is there. And so the Hebrew word is beza, and the egg also plays an important part in the Passover Seder. Now, we don't see this description of the Passover Seder in the Bible. There are certain things done in the Passover Seder that clearly developed after AD 70, when the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed. But we also need to realize that there's also elements in the New Testament that also arose out of tradition in Judaism. And so I don't have time to go into it now, but the use of wine or the use of the cup during the Passover is not something you find in the Old Testament. And yet Jesus himself used it. He broke bread and he took the cup and so forth. The important point to mention here is that the egg in the Passover Seder, the egg actually is hard-boiled, and it symbolizes the destruction. The reason why they have the egg there, and if you look to the left there, you'll notice there's a cup with some water in it. Well, that cup has salt in it. It's salted water. And what you do during the Passover Seder is in one of the the reminders, as they're reminiscing the time of their slavery in Egypt, what they would do is they take the egg, they'll crack it. In some cases, the egg's already cracked. And what they'll do is they'll dip it in the salt water to remind them of the tears of their ancestors who suffered slavery in Egypt. But the saltiness doesn't just remind them of the tears of the slavery in Egypt, but it also reminds them of the destruction of the temple. And so they weep in remembering the destruction of the temple. The egg, because it was supposed to be also boiled and then oven roasted, it would take on almost a brownish color to the exterior white of the egg. And the egg also came to represent the sacrifice, that the sacrifices that took place in the temple. And also, another reason why they dipped the egg in salt water is the rabbis taught that Abraham actually died on the eve of Passover, which is the 14th day of Nisan, of the Hebrew month Nisan. And so the dipping of the egg in the salt water is not just to remind them of the tears of slavery, the tears of the destruction of the temple, but also the tears in remembering the passing of their forefather Abraham. And so you notice there's a connection here between the Christian celebration of Easter and the Passover Seder in their use of an egg. And of course, the Jews didn't get this from paganism as well. The egg simply here represents something that has to do with their redemptive history. And so we need to understand then that the use of the egg in Christianity and also in Judaism has nothing whatsoever to do with the idea that it was borrowed from paganism, or it was the ancient pagans who used eggs and so forth and so on. And so this then brings us to the question of the Easter bunny. And of course, the question is, well, what does a rabbit or a bunny have to do with eggs? Well, not very much. But the reason why the rabbit or the bunny came to be associated with Easter was not that the rabbit lays eggs of any sort, but this was a much later development that occurred much, much later in history. And the reason why the bunny or the rabbit came to be associated with Easter time is because during the springtime, what would happen is rabbits would begin to emerge from their underground burrows. And so for some Christians in Europe, when they would notice the coming of spring, they would notice that the snow had melted and so forth, they noticed that these rabbits would start emerging out of their burrows that were underground. And so the idea of rising, the idea of these rabbits rising up or emerging, coming out of this tomb-like burrow in the ground, reminded them of the reality of the resurrection. So this wasn't an attempt to denigrate the resurrection of Christ, but they saw an interesting connection there between the idea of these animals living under the ground in a tomb-like burrow and then coming up out of their burrows. And so in a sense, the rabbit almost humorously becomes something like a mascot, which if you've watched sports like football, a mascot usually is a representative, a humorous representative of the team. And so the reason why Christians came to connect rabbits with Easter time is simply because of this imagery of the rabbit coming up, arising out of their burrows. And so there was a connection that many made there. Now, in terms of the evolution and development of these practices, so if we look at a timeline here, and we look at, for example, the death of Jesus, which was approximately around somewhere between 30 to 33 AD, we know that from the earliest times, the early Christians did celebrate the resurrection of Jesus. And for a time, a lot of these Christians would celebrate the resurrection of Jesus on what's called the 14th day of Nisan. And so they would correspond the time of the celebration of the resurrection of Jesus with the Jewish calendar. And the reason why it's called the Quartodeciman controversy is because the word quartodeciman is Latin for 14. So if you know Spanish or Portuguese or Italian, you'll know that quarto means 4, and deci comes from the word for 10. And so quartodeciman means 14th. Shortly after that, some Christians felt that it was too Jewish to celebrate the resurrection on the 14th day of Nisan. And the reason for that is that the 14th day of Nisan, which is the Passover, because the Jews follow a lunar month, that day would fall in different days of the week. So Passover could fall on a Sunday, it could fall on a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. It could even fall on the Thursday, Friday, even a Saturday. And so because it was a lunar calendar, it was never a fixed day. It could go from one day to another day. Well, some later Christians felt that to celebrate the resurrection of Christ, it is proper to celebrate it only on the first day of the week, on Sunday. Why celebrate it on a Thursday or Friday? Because it falls with the Jewish lunar calendar. If Christ was raised on a Sunday, then that should be the proper date to celebrate his resurrection. And so around 325 AD, with the Council of Nicaea, many Christians, with the authority of the emperor, they designated that Easter would always be celebrated, always, on the first Sunday of the first full moon of the spring equinox. And so if you look at your calendar and you look at the beginning of the spring equinox and you look at the first full moon, the first Sunday after that first full moon will always be Sunday. And that will always be Easter Sunday. And that's how, up to this day, that day has been celebrated. Now, as we move forward, the first mention of this alleged goddess being called Oster appears in Northern England. And if you saw my previous video, we noted how the Venerable Bede, who was a British monk, writing about the history of England, he talked about the Anglo-Saxons and the Germanic peoples. And he was the first to say that these people worshipped a spring goddess by the name of Oster. And as we saw in that video, not only is he the only one who ever made that claim, he admits he's the only one making that claim, and he admits this is his own interpretation. And what we saw was that outside of Bede's writings, there is no evidence whatsoever, no writing among the Anglo-Saxon writings to substantiate Bede's claim that Oster was an actual spring goddess. In other words, most historians, most scholars who specialize in the field of European antiquity and medieval Europe and so forth would argue that Bede actually was incorrect, gravely incorrect. There was never a spring goddess by the name of Oster. So if you have any questions, please watch my video. Is Oster the name of a spring goddess? Now, the word Ostara was, as a German word for Easter, begins to appear around the year 800 AD. And so the word Oster, which is originally was connected to the idea of opening and beginnings. And then it later became the German word for the East, hence the English word Easter. And we talked about how that points to the rising, the place of the rising, where the sun rose, the East. And so the idea of rising became associated with that word. And then by the year 1000 AD, all the way till 1200 AD, it's at that time that eggs start getting associated with Easter, particularly in Western Europe. It was already associated with Easter in Eastern Europe before that time. It's not on this graph, but in the West, people start using the eggs, and we've already discussed what is the purpose behind that. The first appearance of the Easter bunny, the rabbit, first appears in Germany. And this appears in the medieval period. It appears towards the end of the 17th century. So as we approach the 1700s, that's the first time the rabbit is associated. Notice that this is not based on paganism. It is something that people in Germany generally observed, with the rabbits rising out of their burrows and so forth. You also begin to see around the year 1700 painted Easter eggs among Christians in Turkey and in Persia. The tradition of using hot cross buns appears in England after the 1700s begin, or in the 1700s rather. And then, of course, as we move along in history, around 1850, you've got St. Albans buns appearing in Soho, London, and using these buns. Some of them would have eggs in them and so forth. All of these being associated with the idea of new life in Christ. And so that then brings us to the conclusion of our analysis of Easter. And so I hope that you have been able to glean a number of important points here, and that you have been informed about these very important issues. What we need to stop doing is we need to stop repeating the same mantra over and over again, repeating things we've heard before without checking them out, without consultation, and so forth. As Christians, we are people of the truth. We must love truth. If we claim to follow him who said, "I am the truth," then truth should matter to us. And so we need to, once again, state for the record, Easter is not a pagan holiday. The word Easter has nothing to do with the spring goddess. And there's nothing wrong with there's nothing wrong with using the word Easter to refer to Easter Sunday. Luther did it. William Tyndale did it in England. And so the reason for that word is because, whether we like it or not, English is a descendant of the Anglo-Saxon Germanic languages. And as a result of that, these words have come into our English language. And so I hope that this has been beneficial. And I pray that you'll take these things to heart. And I wish you all a blessed Easter. And always remember, Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. And he is our hope. And so thank you again for watching. We encourage you to like the video. And we also encourage you, if you have not done so already, to subscribe to the channel. The channel is absolutely free. And we will have other videos like this from time to time posted on this channel, including many other interviews that I have engaged with other speakers and others that will be coming on. So thank you again, everybody. God bless you all. And again, once again, happy Easter. Bye for now.